That's not fair, Thomas. You've worked so hard on your own terms. Well, apparently forging my own path outside the family business was unforgivable. He set his glass down with a sharp clink. They all just sat there. Nobody said a word. Even Mom, who always claimed to support my choices. I moved to the stove, stirring the mole sauce that had been simmering. Cooking had always been my refuge, the place I went when words failed. "Dinner's almost ready," I said softly. "Your favorite chilaquiles?" Thomas nodded absently, his mind clearly still in that wood-paneled study where his worth had been quantified and found wanting. I plated the food, the rich aroma of chocolate and chilies filling our kitchen, but I knew neither of us would taste it properly tonight. We ate in relative silence, the weight of the day settling around us like a heavy fog. As I cleared the plates, Thomas finally spoke again. "There's one more thing." His voice had that careful neutrality that always preceded difficult news. "Richard is accelerating his 5-year plan for the company. They're opening 3 new stores by year's end." I raised an eyebrow. "In this economy? The grocery industry is being cannibalized by delivery services." That's what I said. Thomas rubbed his temples. But with grandmother gone, there's no one to challenge Richard. He's convinced expansion is the only way forward, and Valerie and Andrew are backing him. "And your parents?" "Dad's always wanted to grow. Mom has concerns, but she won't contradict." Richard openly. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time that evening. "They want me to come on board, head of community relations, to strengthen the Mitchell brand during the expansion." The dish in my hand nearly slipped. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd think about it." The silence that followed was deafening. "You'd consider working for the family that just snubbed you in your grandmother's will?" I tried to keep the incredulity from my voice, but failed miserably. Thomas stood, carrying his glass to the sink. "It's complicated, Elena. The company is still family, even if grandmother's decisions weren't fair. And what about Raíces? What about all our plans?" The restaurant was finally breaking even, with reservations booked weeks in advance. Our dream of opening a second location focusing on a chef's tasting menu was finally starting to seem possible. "Nothing would change with Raíces," he insisted. "This would just be a steady income while your restaurant continues to grow." "My restaurant?" The words felt like a slap. "Last time I checked, we were partners in Raíces." Thomas had the grace to look contrite. "Our restaurant, of course. I just meant the daily operations would still be your domain." He reached for my hand. "Let's not fight about this tonight. I'm exhausted." I wanted to press further, to make him see the subtle manipulation at work, how his family had strategically used his disappointment about the will to pull him back into their orbit, but the defeated slump of his shoulders stopped me. "We'll talk more tomorrow," I conceded. That night, I lay awake long after Thomas's breathing had evened into sleep. The moonlight filtered through our bedroom window, casting silvery shadows across our walls. I thought about the day we'd opened Raíces, the pride in Thomas's eyes as he'd watched me welcome our first guests. The way he'd defended my vision to investors who wanted to mainstream the menu. The nights he'd stayed late, washing dishes when a staff member called out sick. Where was that Thomas now? And how could I bring him back? The following weeks unfolded in a blur of tension and unspoken resentments. Thomas began attending preliminary meetings at Mitchell's headquarters, just to understand the scope of the position, he claimed. His absence at Raíces was noticeable, both to me and to our staff. 3 weeks after the will reading, I was in the restaurant kitchen prepping for dinner service when Maya cornered me by the walk-in refrigerator. "So it's true?" she demanded, arms crossed. "Thomas is going to work for the Mitchells?" I focused on trimming asparagus, avoiding her piercing gaze. "He's considering it." "Considering it?" Maya's eyebrows shot up. "Elena, he was in their offices again yesterday. Diego saw him when he was delivering our special order to Mitchell's Fine Foods. I set down my knife, the weight of it all suddenly too heavy. It's complicated. It's not complicated, it's a betrayal, Maya retorted. After they excluded you from the will reading? After they've looked down on this restaurant from day one? Keep your voice down, I hissed, glancing toward the prep area where our line cooks were working. This isn't the place. Maya took a deep breath, visibly centering herself. I'm sorry, I just can't stand watching them pull him back into the fold while pushing you further out. He feels obligated, I said, the excuse sounding hollow even, to my own ears. And with the expansion plans, they need someone the local vendors trust. And that's conveniently the man whose wife has spent years building relationships with every farmer and producer in the Willamette Valley, Maya said pointedly. The truth of her words hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't allowed myself to see it, but of course, that was part of their calculation. My husband wasn't just valuable to them for his business acumen or his Mitchell name. He was valuable because he was married to me, to the connections I'd cultivated, to the goodwill I'd built among local producers who were increasingly skeptical of large retail chains. I need to finish prep, I said, turning back to my asparagus. But my hands were unsteady, my chef's knife suddenly awkward in my grip. Elena, Maya's voice softened. You've worked too hard to let them appropriate everything you've built. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As she walked away, I felt something shift inside me, a hardening resolve where uncertainty had been festering. That evening, I waited until service was complete, until the last customer had left with satisfied smiles and compliments to the chef. The kitchen was clean, the staff gone. Only then did I allow myself to slump into a chair at the empty bar, pouring a glass of the Oregon Pinot Noir we'd just added to our list. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Meeting running late. Don't wait up. The third such message this week. I twirled the wine in my glass, watching it catch the dim light of the restaurant's evening setting. Raíces had been my dream long before I met Thomas, back when I was working 16-hour days as a line cook, scribbling menu ideas in tattered notebooks. A restaurant that honored my Mexican heritage while celebrating the bounty of the Pacific Northwest. A place that treated farmers as partners, not vendors. A kitchen that wasted nothing and respected everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You should have been included. His eyes held mine steadily. That was Richard's doing, not Evelyn's. He convinced the lawyers it was a private family business matter. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Why would he do that? Because he knew what was coming next. This aggressive expansion plan. He knew you'd see through it, with your business sense. You've succeeded where most restaurants fail in their first year. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his bed. He needed you sidelined before he made his move to bring Thomas in. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The calculated exclusion, the convenient timing of the job offer to Thomas, the subtle leveraging of his disappointment over the will. What exactly do you want from me, Harold? I asked, clutching the folder. I want you to save my company, he replied simply. I want you to help Thomas see what's really happening, before it's too late. Before I could respond, the door swung open. Diane Mitchell stood in the doorway, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and tailored suit a stark contrast to my chef's pants and wrinkled button-down. Elena? Surprise and suspicion mingled in her voice. What are you doing here? Harold's expression immediately shifted, a mask of paternal authority sliding back into place. I asked her to come, Diane. A matter regarding Thomas. Diane's eyes narrowed as she noticed the folder in my hands. What's that? Just some paperwork Harold wanted me to pass along, I said, rising from my chair. I should go. Let you have some family time. The emphasis on family wasn't lost on Diane, whose lips thinned perceptibly. "I'll look into what we discussed," I told Harold, tucking the folder into my bag. He nodded once, a businessman's acknowledgement of a deal struck. "Thank you for coming, Elena." As I moved toward the door, Diane's hand caught my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Whatever my husband has told you, remember where your loyalties should lie," she murmured, too low for Harold to hear. I met her gaze evenly. "My loyalty has always been to Thomas," I replied, "and to the truth. Good night, Diane." As I walked out of the hospital into the cool Portland night, the weight of the folder in my bag felt like a ticking bomb. Whatever it contained would change everything. My relationship with Thomas, his relationship with his family, perhaps the future of Mitchell's Fine Foods itself. I pulled out my phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing. "Maya? It's me. I need your help with something. Can you meet me at Raíces in 20 minutes? Whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone, and I wouldn't be sidelined any longer." Maya arrived at Raíces in record time, her curly hair damp from the light. Rain, concern etched across her face. I had already spread Harold's documents across our largest prep table, the stainless steel surface now covered with spreadsheets, projections, and internal memos. "This is insane," Maya whispered, scanning the papers with widening eyes. "Are these numbers accurate?" I nodded grimly. "According to Harold, yes. Mitchell's Fine Foods has been hemorrhaging money for the past 18 months. Their cash reserves are dangerously low, and they've leveraged several properties for the expansion." Maya picked up a market analysis report, her brow furrowing. "Their business model is completely outdated. Specialty grocers are getting squeezed from both ends, regular supermarkets carrying more gourmet items, and meal delivery services taking the high-end customers." She looked up at me. "Why would Richard push for expansion when the core business is struggling?" "That's what I can't figure out," I admitted, pouring us both a glass of wine from the bottle I'd opened earlier. Unless what? Unless he's trying to inflate the company's value before selling it. The thought had been forming in my mind as I drove from the hospital, pieces clicking together like a dark puzzle. Create the appearance of growth to attract a buyer, then cash out before the whole thing implodes. Maya's eyes narrowed. Would he really tank his family's legacy business? "You've met Richard," I said flatly. "Everything's a transaction to him." We spent the next 3 hours poring over the documents, making notes, searching for patterns. With Maya's background in finance before she'd switched to the culinary world, she spotted things I would have missed, hidden losses concealed through accounting maneuvers, concerning trends in customer retention. "Elena, if Thomas joins the company now," Maya began. "I know," I cut her off, not wanting to hear the conclusion we'd both reached. "His reputation would be tarnished when it fails. He'd be associated with a sinking ship." By the time we finished, it was well past midnight. The rain had intensified, drumming against the restaurant's windows in a steady rhythm. I gathered the documents, tucking them back into the folder. "What are you going to do?" Maya asked, as she shrugged into her jacket. I sighed, suddenly exhausted, beyond words. "I have to tell Thomas everything. Show him these documents. Make him understand what he's walking into." Maya nodded, but her expression was guarded. "And if he doesn't believe you? If he thinks you're just trying to keep him from his family?" The question struck a nerve, exposing my deepest fear. Thomas had been so withdrawn lately, so receptive to his family's overtures. What if he saw this as manipulation on my part? "Then I'll have tried," I said simply. "I can't force him to see the truth, but I can make sure he has all the facts before making a decision." Maya hugged me tightly before leaving. "Call me tomorrow, no matter what happens." I locked up Raíces and drove home through the wet streets, rehearsing what I would say to Thomas, how I would present Harold's revelations without seeming accusatory or desperate. But when I arrived home, the house was dark. Thomas wasn't there. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. I dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. A flicker of worry ignited in my chest. It was nearly 2 a.m. Board meetings. Didn't run this late, even for the Mitchells. I was about to call Richard when my phone buzzed with a text. Thomas. At the hospital with Dad. We'll explain later. Don't wait up. The hospital. Of course. News of Harold's condition must have reached the family. Relief mingled with a strange apprehension. Thomas was with his family at his father's bedside. The same father who had just secretly passed me documents exposing the company's precarious position. I tried to sleep but found it impossible, my mind racing with the implications of everything I'd learned. Instead, I went to our home office and began typing up my own analysis of Harold's documents, translating the corporate jargon into clear, straightforward assessments that Thomas couldn't misinterpret. Dawn was breaking when I heard the front door open. Thomas entered our bedroom looking haggard, his suit rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. "How's your father?" I asked immediately, setting aside my laptop. "Stable." Thomas sank onto the edge of the bed. "The doctors say it was a warning sign, not a full-blown heart attack. They're keeping him for observation, running tests." He rubbed his face. It was chaos at the hospital, Mom falling apart, Richard taking charge, Valerie crying hysterically. I waited a beat before asking the inevitable question. "Did your father mention that I visited him earlier?" Thomas's head snapped up, surprise clear in his expression. "You were at the hospital? When?" Before everyone else arrived, Harold asked to see me specifically. "Why would Dad ask for you?" The confusion in his voice held no accusation, just genuine bewilderment. I reached for the folder on my nightstand. "Because he wanted me to give you this, to make sure you saw it before making any decisions about joining the company." Thomas took the folder with hesitation. "What is it?" "The truth about Mitchell's Fine Foods. The real financial situation." I met his eyes steadily. "Thomas, the company is in serious trouble, and Richard's expansion plan is only going to make it worse." He opened the folder slowly, as if it might contain something dangerous. In many ways, it did. I watched his expression change as he leafed through the documents, confusion giving way to disbelief, then alarm, and finally a deep, somber understanding. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his eyes. "Dad gave you these? Willingly?" I nodded. "He's worried about the company, about you. He doesn't want you caught in the fallout when Richard's plans implode." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing our bedroom. "This doesn't make sense." At the board meeting yesterday, Richard presented projections showing growth across all sectors. The new stores are supposed to increase market share by 15% within 2 years. "Those projections are fantasies," I said gently. "Maya," and I spent half the night analyzing these numbers. "The core business is struggling, Thomas. The expansion is just smoke and mirrors." He stopped pacing, fixing me with a penetrating look. "Why would my father go behind the family's back, share confidential company information with you instead of coming to me directly?" It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of the Mitchell family dynamics. "Because he knew you might not believe him," I said carefully. "He said you have a blind spot when it comes to Richard, that you've always trusted his judgment in business matters." Thomas flinched as if I'd struck him. "That's not," he began, then stopped, reconsidering. "Is it true? Have I been that predictable?" "You've always wanted your family's approval," I said, standing to join him. "There's nothing wrong with that, but it might have made you less critical of certain things." He nodded slowly, the truth of it settling over him like a heavy mantle. "I need to talk to Dad, to hear it from him directly." "Of course," I agreed. "But Thomas, why didn't Richard tell you about your father's condition immediately? Why?" Were you in a board meeting while Harold was being rushed to the hospital? The question hung in the air between us, laden with implications neither of us wanted to voice aloud. I don't know, Thomas admitted, a new edge to his voice. But I intend to find out. We arrived at the hospital just as visiting hours began, the morning sun casting long shadows through the corridor windows. Thomas walked with purpose, the folder of documents tucked securely under his arm. Whatever doubts he'd had about his father's motivations, he was determined to get answers. Harold's room was empty except for a nurse checking his vitals. He looked marginally better than the previous night. Some color returned to his face, but the hospital setting still diminished him in ways that were painful to witness. Thomas, Harold greeted his son with evident relief. And Elena. Good. His eyes flickered to the folder in Thomas's hands. I see you've had a chance to review the materials. Is it true? Thomas asked without preamble. All of it? Harold nodded grimly. Every number, every projection. Richard has been selectively presenting data to the board for months, emphasizing the positive metrics while burying the concerning trends. Why didn't you stop him? You're still the majority shareholder. For now, Harold sighed heavily. But the bylaws require a 3/4 majority for major directional changes. With Richard, Valerie, and your mother voting as a bloc, and most of the independent board members swayed by Richard's charisma. He trailed off. So you just let the company drive toward a cliff? Thomas's voice rose slightly, drawing a concerned glance from the nurse. I've been working behind the scenes, Harold countered, looking for strategic partners, exploring new business models that could save Mitchell's without abandoning our core values. You want to essentially transform Mitchell's Fine Foods from a traditional grocery chain into a community-based food hub built around sustainability, zero waste, and direct producer relationships? Exactly, Thomas nodded. It's not just a moral imperative, it's a business one. The traditional grocery model is dying. To survive, Mitchell's needs to evolve. And quickly, I added, before Richard secures funding for an expansion that will likely bankrupt the company. Stephanie tapped her stylish glasses thoughtfully. It's ambitious. Transforming an established business is always harder than building something new. She glanced at the financial documents spread across the table. But these numbers make a compelling case for radical change. Gabriel, who had been silently studying Harold's portfolio of properties, looked up. The real estate holdings alone make this viable. Some of these locations could be converted to hybrid marketplace restaurants, showcasing local producers while still functioning as neighborhood grocery stores. Like what Italy did for Italian food, but with a Pacific Northwest focus and a sustainability ethos, Maya suggested, warming to the concept. And we could implement a zero-waste protocol similar to what we use at Raíces, I added. Excitement, building as our vision took shape. Composting programs, bulk foods to reduce packaging, a whole ingredient approach to the prepared food sections. Thomas nodded, energy radiating from him as he outlined his thoughts. We'd need to start small, pilot the concept in one location to prove it works before rolling it out more broadly. The real question, Stephanie interjected pragmatically, is how you get control of the company to implement any of this. If Richard opposes the direction and he has board support, we need to convince the independent board members, Thomas replied. They're not family, but they hold the swing votes on major decisions. And they're business people first, Maya pointed out. They'll need to see this isn't just idealism. It's a viable business strategy with reasonable ROI projections. For the next several hours, we developed a comprehensive proposal, combining the financial data from Harold with our collective expertise. Chef Gabriel helped outline a culinary program that would differentiate Mitchell's from competitors. Stephanie contributed insights on technology integration that could streamline operations while enhancing the customer experience. Maya's financial acumen helped us craft revenue projections that were both ambitious and defensible. As evening approached, Thomas sat back, surveying the work we'd accomplished. "This is good," he said with quiet confidence. "Really good. But presenting it to the board won't be enough. We need to show them." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We need to create a prototype, a physical demonstration of what we're proposing." His eyes lit with purpose. "The Mitchell's location in the Pearl District is the smallest in the chain. It's been underperforming for years. What if we temporarily transformed it into our vision? Just for a week?" "A proof of concept." Stephanie nodded approvingly. "Let the board members experience it firsthand, rather than just reviewing projections on paper." "Can we pull that off?" Maya looked skeptical. "Redesigning and restocking an entire grocery store, even temporarily, is a massive undertaking." "Not redesigning," Thomas clarified. "More like reinterpreting. Using the existing space but reimagining how it functions, what it offers, how it feels to shop there." I found myself nodding, my chef's mind already calculating logistics. "We could bring in some of Raíces' producers, create pop-up demonstration kitchens, implement a simplified version of our waste reduction systems. I could contribute technology for direct producer ordering and transparent supply chain tracking," Stephanie offered. "And I know at least a dozen chefs who would jump at the chance to participate in something innovative like this," Gabriel added. The energy in the room was palpable, a creative electricity I hadn't felt since the early planning days of Raíces. For the first time in months, Thomas and I were truly aligned, working toward a shared vision that honored both his family legacy and my culinary philosophy. As our impromptu strategy session wound down, Stephanie pulled me aside while Thomas was deep in conversation with Gabriel about sourcing. "Elena, this is brilliant work," she said quietly. "But you should prepare yourself for significant resistance. Family businesses don't change direction easily, especially when there's a power struggle involved." I nodded, appreciating her candor. "I know. Richard won't give up control without a fight." "It's not just Richard," Stephanie cautioned. "Change is threatening to everyone invested in the status quo. The existing executives, suppliers with favorable contracts, even customers comfortable with the current model." She squeezed my arm gently. "I believe in this vision, but the path won't be smooth." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," I replied, watching Thomas as he gestured animatedly, explaining something to Maya with newfound enthusiasm. "But for the first time in years, I feel like we're fighting for something together, not against each other." Stephanie smiled. "That alone makes it worth pursuing." Later that evening, as Thomas and I drove home under a sky turning deep purple with twilight, a comfortable silence settled between us, the kind we hadn't shared in too long. "Thank you," Thomas said finally, his eyes on the road ahead. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, on us." His voice was low, tinged with regret. "I've been lost these past few months, caught between what my family expected and what I knew was right." I reached across the console to touch his arm. "You found your way back." "Because of you," he insisted. "If you hadn't gone to see my father, if you hadn't shown me those documents." He shook his head. "I might have made the biggest mistake of my life." "We're partners, remember?" I reminded him gently. "That's what we do, keep each other from making terrible mistakes." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Well, I owe you one. A big one." As we pulled into our driveway, Thomas's phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression darkening. "Richard?" I guessed. Thomas nodded. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Apparently there are urgent matters of company security and confidentiality to discuss." He looked at me grimly. "He's making his move." "Then we need to make ours," I replied, determination hardening my resolve. "Tonight." We stayed up until the early hours, refining our proposal, preparing presentation materials, reaching out to allies who might support our vision. Thomas called 3 of the independent board members he had relationships with, carefully laying the groundwork for what we would present the next day. By dawn, we were exhausted but ready. As Thomas knotted his tie, the same burgundy one he'd worn to the will reading that had started this entire chain of events, I handed him a travel mug of strong coffee. "Whatever happens today," I said, meeting his eyes in the mirror, "we face it together." He turned, taking my hands in his. "Richard will use every weapon he has, Elena. He'll make this personal. He'll try to turn the family against us completely." "Let him try," I replied steadily. "We have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "The truth, and a vision worth fighting for." Thomas smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with years ago. "Then let's go change the future of Mitchell's Fine Foods." As we drove toward the Mitchell corporate headquarters, the early morning sun glinting off the sleek glass tower, I felt a curious blend of nervousness and absolute certainty. Whatever the outcome of today's meeting, something fundamental had already changed. Thomas and I had rediscovered our partnership, our shared purpose, our strength as a team. The Mitchell family had excluded me from their will reading, dismissing me as an outsider unworthy of their inner circle. Now I was about to walk into their boardroom and fight not just for my place in the family, but for the very future of their legacy. Harold had entrusted us with saving Mitchell's Fine Foods, but in the process, we might just save something even more valuable: the heart and soul of the Mitchell family itself. The Mitchell family boardroom occupied the entire top floor of their corporate headquarters, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Portland's skyline and the distant mountains beyond. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the grandeur of the space, the gleaming walnut table that could seat 20, the tasteful artwork depicting Oregon landscapes, the subtle displays of awards and accolades the company had accumulated over its 70-year history. But today, all I could focus on was the palpable tension as we entered. Every head turned in our direction, conversations halting mid-sentence. Thomas walked slightly ahead of me, his shoulders squared, projecting a confidence I knew he was working hard to maintain. I followed, clutching my leather portfolio containing our proposal, acutely aware that I was the first non-Mitchell to ever participate in a board meeting. Richard stood at the head of the table, his expression momentarily faltering at the sight of us. He recovered quickly, his corporate mask sliding seamlessly back into place. "Thomas," he nodded curtly, "we weren't expecting you to bring guests." Thomas didn't miss a beat. "Elena isn't a guest, Richard. She's my wife and business partner, and she's integral to what I'll be presenting today." A murmur rippled through the room. Diane Mitchell, seated to Richard's right, pressed her lips into a thin line of disapproval. Valerie and Andrew exchanged glances from their seats further down the table. Harold's chair remained conspicuously empty. "This is a closed board meeting dealing with sensitive company matters," Richard countered smoothly. "I'm afraid Mrs. Mitchell will have to wait outside." Before Thomas could object, one of the independent board members, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, interjected. "Actually, Richard, there's no bylaw preventing a board member from bringing advisors to a meeting." She turned toward me with an appraising look. "Elena Mitchell, isn't it? Barbara Thompson. I've dined at your restaurant several times. Remarkable concept." I felt a rush of gratitude for this unexpected ally. "Thank you, Ms. Thompson. It's a pleasure to meet you." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Fine, let's get started then." He tapped his tablet, and the room's lighting dimmed as a projection screen descended from the ceiling. "As I mentioned in my message, we have an urgent security matter to address." The screen illuminated with a spreadsheet, one I recognized, immediately from Harold's documents. My stomach clenched. Yesterday, Richard continued, his voice taking on a grave tone, we discovered that confidential company financial records were removed from secured files. After a thorough investigation, we've determined that these documents were accessed without authorization and shared with parties outside the company. His gaze settled on Thomas. Given the timing and circumstances, I've been forced to conclude that this breach originated with our father, possibly due to his diminished capacity following his health episode. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Thomas stiffened beside me. How dare you, he said, his voice low, but carrying. Father is perfectly sound of mind, as any of his doctors would attest. Richard raised his hands in a gesture of false sympathy. I understand this is difficult to hear, Thomas. We're all concerned about Dad's health. But the facts are clear. Highly sensitive financial information was removed from my office and shared inappropriately. Information that, in the wrong hands, could severely damage Mitchell's competitive position. Or perhaps, Thomas countered, information that reveals decisions made without full board awareness or approval. The independent board members exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before them. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. I think we all know that Dad has been resistant to necessary modernization efforts. Change is difficult, especially for someone of his generation who built the business in a different era. This isn't about resistance to change, Thomas said firmly. It's about transparency and honest accounting. He stood, moving to the front of the room. Since we're discussing these documents anyway, why don't we examine what they actually contain? Richard shifted, his composure slipping for a moment. I don't think that's... I agree with Thomas, Barbara Thompson interjected. If there's information pertinent to the company's financial status that hasn't been fully disclosed to the board, we should review it immediately. Other independent board members nodded in agreement, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Richard was outmaneuvered, at least temporarily. Thomas connected his tablet to the room's display system, bringing up the first of Harold's documents, a comprehensive analysis of Mitchell's declining profit margins across all store locations over the past 8 quarters. As you can see, Thomas began, his voice steady and authoritative, the company's core performance metrics have been trending downward consistently, not dramatically, but persistently, indicating structural challenges rather than cyclical fluctuations. For the next 20 minutes, Thomas systematically walked through the financial realities that Richard had been carefully concealing from the board. The decreasing customer retention rates, the rising costs of maintaining outdated supply chains, the concerning cash flow projections if current operational models continued. I watched the board members' expressions shift from skepticism to concern, and finally to alarm. Richard attempted to interject several times, but the numbers spoke for themselves, and Barbara Thompson firmly kept the presentation moving forward. The most concerning aspect, Thomas concluded, isn't the current state, but the projected impact of the expansion plan. He displayed a cash flow analysis that plainly showed Mitchell's reserves being depleted to dangerous levels within 18 months, if the company proceeded with opening the 3 new locations as Richard had planned. Richard slammed his hand on the table. These projections are based on worst-case scenarios and outdated assumptions. Our actual financial modeling tells a completely different story. Then produce it, Barbara challenged. Show us the detailed financial models that support your expansion strategy. Richard faltered, and I knew why. Those models either didn't exist or were based on manipulated data that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. We'd appreciate that, I said warmly, extending an olive branch to this unexpected ally. I'll email you, Andrew promised, before hurrying away as Richard glanced in our direction. In the elevator descending from the boardroom, Thomas leaned against the wall, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally fading. 1 week, he sighed. Not much time to solidify our position. But enough to start building momentum, I countered. Andrew's on board, at least tentatively. The independent directors seem receptive, and we don't need to win everyone over. Just enough to block Richard's expansion plans. Thomas squeezed my hand. Have I mentioned recently how remarkable you are? I smiled, the compliment warming me despite the stress of the morning. Once or twice, but I'll never tire of hearing it. As we exited the Mitchell building, the spring sunshine felt symbolic, a brightness breaking through after months of tension and uncertainty. We weren't victorious yet, but for the first time, our vision for the future seemed possible. We should visit your father, I suggested as we reached our car. Update him on what happened. Thomas nodded, his expression softening with concern. He'll be pleased about the postponement but frustrated by the delay. Then we'll just have to use this week wisely, I replied, starting with making our pilot plan so compelling that no one can reasonably oppose it. At the hospital, we found Harold sitting up in bed, looking markedly improved from the previous day. His color had returned, and the monitors tracking his vital signs showed steady, normal patterns. He was working on a laptop despite what I assumed were strict medical instructions against it. There you are, he said, closing the computer as we entered. I've been waiting for news. Thomas pulled chairs to his bedside as I closed the door to ensure privacy. We presented everything, Thomas began, outlining the board meeting in detail. The initial confrontation over the stolen documents, our presentation of the alternative strategy, the division among board members, and Richard's ultimate capitulation to postponement. Harold listened intently, his shrewd eyes absorbing every nuance of the account. When Thomas finished, he nodded slowly. You've created an opening, he said thoughtfully. Richard expected to bulldoze this expansion through while I was sidelined. Now he's forced to defend his strategy against a viable alternative. But we only have a week, I pointed out. Is that enough time to build sufficient support? Harold's expression turned calculating, reminding me forcefully that beneath his current vulnerability lay decades of business acumen. A week is plenty, he replied with surprising confidence. Especially if we can demonstrate rather than just theorize. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? You proposed a pilot at the Pearl District location, Harold reminded us. Why wait? For formal approval? Begin implementing elements of your plan immediately, unofficially. I exchanged glances with Thomas, intrigued by the suggestion. We don't have the authority to make official changes to store operations, I noted. No, Harold agreed. But you have relationships with producers, culinary expertise, and innovative ideas that don't require board approval to showcase. A slow smile spread across Thomas's face as he caught his father's meaning. Pop-up demonstrations within the existing store, educational events, taste comparisons between standard products and sustainable alternatives. Exactly, Harold nodded approvingly. Nothing that formally changes operations, but experiences that allow board members and customers to see your vision in action before the vote. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. We couldn't officially transform the store without board approval, but we could create windows into what that transformation might look like. We'd need cooperation from the Pearl District store manager, I said, mentally cataloging what would be required. Julia Hernandez, Harold supplied immediately. She's been frustrated with corporate directives for years. Show her how your approach addresses her pain points, and she'll be an advocate, not an obstacle. Thomas was already typing notes into his phone, his energy rekindled. We could start with weekend demonstrations, building toward a more comprehensive showcase just before the board reconvenes. Focus on metrics that matter to different stakeholders, Harold advised. Barbara Thompson cares about financial sustainability. James Chen is passionate about innovation. Diane worries about brand perception. I was struck once again by the depth of Harold's strategic thinking, how thoroughly he understood the motivations and concerns of everyone involved. Why didn't you present this alternative yourself? I asked suddenly. Before Richard's expansion, plan gained momentum? Harold's expression turned rueful. Because I'm part of the old guard, Elena. My objections would have been dismissed as resistance to change rather than legitimate concerns. He looked between us with unmistakable pride. But you two represent something new, tradition and innovation working in harmony. That's a compelling narrative, especially coming from the Mitchell who was all but disinherited by his grandmother. The pointed reference to the will reading that had started this entire chain of events wasn't lost on me. What had begun as a painful exclusion had ultimately created the conditions for this moment, for Thomas to step forward with a different vision for the family legacy. We should get started right away, Thomas said, his strategic mind already racing ahead. Contact Julia, coordinate with Maya and the others, prepare materials for demonstrations. Harold held up a hand, his expression turning serious. Before you go, there's something else you should know. He reached for a folder tucked beneath his laptop. Richard's expansion plan isn't just financially unsound, it's potentially something worse. Thomas took the folder with visible trepidation. What do you mean? Those are copies of communications between Richard and Nexus Retail Partners, Harold explained. A corporate acquisition firm specializing in purchasing regional chains, stripping their assets, and reselling the diminished businesses. I leaned forward to study the documents as Thomas spread them on the bed. Email exchanges, meeting notes, preliminary term sheets, all pointing toward a disturbing conclusion. He's planning to sell Mitchell's? Thomas asked incredulously. After the expansion increases the valuation? Harold nodded grimly. The expansion isn't about growth. It's about creating an attractive acquisition target. The new stores would increase the company's market footprint and real estate holdings, making it more valuable to Nexus even as they strain our operational capacity. The betrayal cut deep. Richard wasn't just pursuing a misguided business strategy, he was actively working to sell the family legacy out from under them. Does anyone else know about this? I asked, still processing the implications. No, Harold replied, and we need to be strategic about how we reveal it. Richard will claim, these are just exploratory discussions, that he was seeking partnerships rather than acquisition offers. Thomas was uncharacteristically quiet, his expression shifting through shock, anger, and finally resolution. This changes everything, he said finally. This isn't just about competing business visions anymore. It's about preserving Mitchell's as a family company at all. Harold reached for his son's hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his recent health scare. That's why I came to Elena first. I knew you two together would have the courage and creativity to fight for what matters. Mitchell's isn't just a business. It's our family's contribution to this community, a legacy worth preserving the right way. As we left the hospital with this new information weighing heavily on our minds, Thomas was pensive, his earlier enthusiasm tempered by the revelation of his brother's true intentions. All these years, he said as we drove, I thought Richard's single-minded focus on the company was about commitment to our family legacy. But he's been planning to cash out all along. I rested my hand on his arm, understanding the depth of his disillusionment. People's motives are rarely simple. Maybe he started with good intentions that shifted over time. Thomas shook his head. No, this makes sense of so many things. His resistance to modernization that wouldn't immediately increase valuation, his focus on expanding physical footprint, over improving operations, his marginalization of anyone who questioned his strategy. The pieces were indeed falling into place, painting a picture of calculated self-interest disguised as business leadership. So what now? I asked. Do we reveal what we know about Nexus? Thomas considered this carefully. Not yet. Dad's right. Richard would spin it as preliminary exploration, not a definitive plan. His jaw set with determination. We need to make our alternative so compelling that the board rejects the expansion regardless of Richard's intentions. Starting with the Pearl District demonstrations, I nodded. Exactly. Thomas's expression lightened with renewed purpose. Let's pick up Maya and head there now. If Julia Hernandez is as frustrated with corporate as Dad suggests, this could be the beginning of something remarkable. As we navigated through Portland's afternoon traffic, I felt a curious sense of coming full circle. The family that had excluded me from their will reading, that had deemed me unworthy of their inner circle, now depended on my vision and expertise to save their legacy. But this wasn't about vindication anymore. Somewhere along this journey, Mitchell's Fine Foods had ceased to be merely my husband's family company and had become something I genuinely cared about. A business with unrealized potential to connect producers and consumers in meaningful ways, to transform how communities thought about food and sustainability. You're smiling, Thomas observed, glancing away from the road momentarily. Just thinking about how unexpected life can be, I replied. A month ago, I would never have imagined being in this position, fighting to save the very company your family feared I might tarnish by association. Thomas reached for my hand. They were wrong about you. They've always been wrong. The Pearl District store came into view, a mid-century building with the distinctive Mitchell's Fine Foods signage above its entrance. It wasn't the largest or most profitable location in the chain, but it occupied a unique position at the intersection of Portland's traditional downtown and its more eclectic, artistic neighborhoods. The perfect testing ground for a vision that bridged tradition and innovation, legacy and progress. Ready to reinvent grocery shopping? Thomas asked as he parked, his earlier confidence returning. I surveyed the store, already envisioning how we might transform it into something extraordinary. Not just a place to purchase food, but a vibrant hub where the community could connect with the stories, people, and processes behind what they ate. Ready, I affirmed, reaching for the door handle. The Mitchell family had excluded me from their will reading, believing I had nothing of value to contribute to their legacy. Now I was about to show them just how wrong they had been. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of transformation. What had begun as a desperate fight to save Mitchell's Fine Foods became an exciting journey of reinvention that energized the entire company. The Pearl District experiment expanded systematically across all 12 Mitchell's locations, each store adapting our core vision to reflect its neighborhood's unique character and producer relationships. I stood in the newly renovated flagship store downtown, marveling at how far we'd come. The space had been completely reimagined, bright, open, and alive with activity. Gone were the sterile aisles and impersonal displays, replaced by an environment that felt more like a vibrant marketplace than a traditional grocery. Digital integration points connected customers with producer stories and sustainability metrics. The central demonstration kitchen hosted constant programming, cooking classes, producer meetings, zero-waste workshops. Every department told a cohesive story about food, community, and conscious consumption. Still can't believe this is the same Mitchell's, Maya commented, joining me as I surveyed the busy scene. Her role had evolved significantly in recent months, from Raíces co-owner to director of culinary integration for the entire Mitchell's chain. Remember when they wouldn't even carry your salsa because it didn't have a long enough shelf life? I laughed at the memory. Now we sell out of it every week. The flagship store featured a Raíces corner, showcasing products developed in our restaurant's kitchen, salsas, fermentations, preserves, all produced with the same zero-waste philosophy that had become central to Mitchell's new identity. The quarterly numbers are in, Thomas announced, approaching with a tablet in hand, his excitement evident. Since the board's pivotal vote, he had stepped into the role of Chief Innovation Officer, working alongside Harold and Diane to implement our vision across the company. We're up 22% year over year, with customer retention metrics that are absolutely blowing away industry benchmarks. What about the sustainability metrics? I asked. Those indicators had become equally important in our new measurement framework, tracking waste reduction, local sourcing percentages, and carbon footprint across operations. Even better, Thomas confirmed, waste down 40% local sourcing. Up to 65% of perishables, and our overall environmental impact score has improved to an A-, highest in the industry for a chain our size. The board must be thrilled, Maya observed. Ecstatic might be a better word, Thomas agreed. Barbara Thompson actually said, and I quote, "I haven't been this excited about grocery retail in 20 years." The board had undergone its own evolution in the past months. With our vision proving successful, several skeptical members had become enthusiastic champions. 2 had even requested tours of local farms and production facilities to better understand the producer relationships we were fostering. "And the family?" Maya asked more carefully, glancing at Thomas. "Getting there," he replied, his expression more measured. "Dad's fully engaged. He's meeting with an organic dairy cooperative as we speak. Mom's focused on integrating our new direction with the Mitchell's heritage, creating that bridge between past and future." He didn't mention Richard, and neither Maya nor I pressed the point. The aftermath of the board vote had been difficult for everyone. Richard had initially threatened legal action, claiming the board had been manipulated with false information. When that approach failed, he'd demanded a significant buyout of his shares, which the family and board had reluctantly agreed to. He'd left Portland shortly after, reportedly joining a private equity firm in Chicago. The rupture remained painful, for the Mitchell family, especially for Diane. Despite Richard's actions, he was still her firstborn, and his absence at family gatherings left a palpable void. Thomas maintained minimal contact with his brother, occasional text messages that received brief formal responses. Healing would take time, if it came at all. "Elena?" Andrew's voice pulled me from these thoughts. The youngest Mitchell sibling had flourished in the new company structure, stepping into the role of Chief Technology Officer. His previously underutilized talents now drove Mitchell's digital transformation, creating systems that connected producers, operations, and customers in innovative ways. "Perfect timing," I greeted him. Thomas was just sharing the quarterly numbers. "Impressive, right?" Andrew grinned. "But that's not what I came to tell you. The Mitchell Foundation Board just unanimously approved your proposal. Full funding. For the first year, with a commitment to review for potential expansion." I felt a surge of excitement. The Mitchell Foundation had been established generations ago as the family's philanthropic arm, primarily focused on traditional charitable giving. 3 months ago, I'd proposed repurposing part of its resources toward food security initiatives that aligned with our new business model, connecting small-scale producers with underserved communities, creating educational programs about nutrition and cooking, establishing zero-waste protocols for food banks and community kitchens. That's incredible news. I hugged Andrew impulsively, something that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "When can we start implementation?" "Immediately," he confirmed. "Diane is particularly excited about the educational components. She's already reaching out to schools in lower-income neighborhoods about pilot programs." Diane's evolution had perhaps been the most surprising of all. Once the staunch guardian of Mitchell's traditional image, she had gradually embraced our new direction, finding ways to connect it with the company's historical values. Most unexpectedly, she and I had developed a genuine relationship, our shared passion for Mitchell's future bridging the cultural and generational gaps that had once seemed insurmountable. She mentioned wanting to discuss the curriculum over dinner this weekend, Andrew added. "At their house." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Sunday dinner at the Mitchell estate? That's becoming quite a regular occurrence." It was true. Thomas had believed in that vision enough to invest his personal inheritance when banks turned me down. He'd stayed up late reviewing business plans, networked with contractors to renovate our space, rolled up his sleeves during construction. His family had been horrified, a Mitchell working with his hands, covered in drywall dust and paint. So when had it changed? When had the gravitational pull of his family's expectations begun to outweigh the dreams we'd built together? My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. An unknown number. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Is this Evelyn Mitchell?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar and slightly breathless. "Yes, speaking." "Oh, thank goodness. This is Patricia Hayes, Harold Mitchell's assistant. I'm at Providence Portland Medical Center with Mr. Mitchell. He's asked for you specifically." My grip tightened on the phone. "Harold's in the hospital?" "Yes, ma'am. He collapsed during a board meeting. The doctors are saying it's his heart." She lowered her voice. "Mrs. Mitchell is on her way, but he was quite insistent about seeing you before she arrives. He said it's urgent." Confusion washed over me. Harold had barely spoken 10 words to me at the last family gathering. What could possibly be so urgent that he would ask for me, not his wife, not his eldest son, in a moment of crisis? "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, already reaching for my keys. As I drove through Portland's rain-slicked streets toward the hospital, my mind raced with possibilities. Was this some sort of deathbed reconciliation? An apology for years of cold shoulders and thinly veiled disapproval? Or something else entirely? Whatever it was, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing between the Mitchells and me would ever be the same after tonight. The hospital corridors were a sterile maze, the fluorescent lighting harsh against my eyes after the dim intimacy of the restaurant. I found Patricia pacing outside a private room, her tailored suit incongruous in these medical surroundings. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "How is he?" I asked, peering toward the closed door. "Stable for now. The doctors say it was a minor cardiac event, but given his history..." She trailed off. "He's been asking for you repeatedly, rather insistently, actually." I nodded, steeling myself. "I'll go in." Harold Mitchell looked diminished against the white hospital sheets, his imposing presence reduced by the medical equipment surrounding him. His silver hair was disheveled, his skin ashen. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had evaluated and often found me wanting, were as sharp as ever. "Elena," he said, his voice raspier than usual. "You came." "Of course I did," I replied, approaching his bedside cautiously. "You asked for me." "Sit down," he gestured to the chair beside him. "We don't have much time before Diane arrives." "With the cavalry." I perched on the edge of the chair, noticing the financial papers scattered across his bed. Even in a hospital gown, Harold Mitchell was working. "You're probably wondering why I called you here," he began. The thought crossed my mind, I admitted. He almost smiled then, a quirk of his lips that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I've watched you, you know, all these years, your restaurant, your approach to business." He tapped the papers beside him. "You've built something authentic, something with integrity." I blinked, unprepared for what sounded dangerously close to a compliment. "Mitchell's Fine Foods is in trouble," he continued bluntly. "Serious trouble. Richard's expansion plan is going to sink us if we don't change course dramatically." "I don't understand," I said carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" Harold's gaze intensified. "Because Thomas respects you. He listens to you, and he's about to make a terrible mistake by joining this sinking ship." "You're trying to convince your son not to work for your own company?" The irony wasn't lost on me. "I'm trying to save what's left of my legacy," Harold countered. "And I need your help to do it." The monitor beside him beeped, and he grimaced, pressing a hand to his chest. "The grocery business is changing," he continued, his voice strained. "These big box stores, the online delivery services, they're killing traditional retail. Richard refuses to see it. He's expanding when we should be evolving. And what does this have to do with me? Harold reached for a folder on his side table, handing it to me with a slightly trembling hand. This is a comprehensive report on our financial situation. The real numbers, not the ones Richard presents at board meetings. I took the folder hesitantly. Mr. Mitchell, I'm not sure. Harold, he interrupted. After 8 years, you might as well use my name. I swallowed. Hard. Harold, why not show this to Thomas directly? Because Thomas has a blind spot when it comes to his brother. Always has. Harold's expression darkened. Richard can be very convincing, very charismatic when he wants to be. That, at least, I couldn't argue with. The board meeting where Evelyn's will was read, Harold continued. You should have been there. The statement caught me off guard. What? You heard me. You're Thomas's wife. The text message arrived while I was elbow-deep in masa dough, testing a new blue corn tortilla recipe. My phone buzzed once, then again in rapid succession. I would have ignored it completely if I hadn't glimpsed Harold's name on my screen. My father-in-law never texted me. Not once in the 8 years I'd been married to Thomas. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I wiped my hands hastily on my apron and picked up the phone, a sense of unease already creeping up my spine. Will reading tomorrow, 11 a.m. sharp, Mitchell Estate, formal attire required. No greeting, no pleasantries. Just a cold, impersonal directive from the man whose approval I'd once desperately wanted. Below it, a second message. Not necessary for you to attend. Only Mitchell blood relatives. I stared at those words, reading them over and over as if they might somehow rearrange themselves into something less hurtful. My chest tightened as the familiar feeling washed over me, that constant reminder that despite the gold band on my finger, I'd never truly be a Mitchell. My hands trembled slightly as I set the phone down on the counter, blue corn dust settling around it like fallen snow. In the distance, I could hear the rhythmic chopping from Maya's station as she prepped vegetables for tonight's service at Raíces, our restaurant that had somehow survived its first challenging year despite everyone's predictions. Thomas's grandmother, Evelyn Mitchell, had passed away 3 weeks ago. A formidable woman who had started the family's first corner grocery store with her husband back in 1952, a store that had grown into Mitchell's Fine Foods, a chain of upscale markets across the Pacific Northwest. I'd only met her a handful of times, each interaction perfunctory and cool. But still, the exclusion stung in ways I couldn't articulate. The next morning, I watched Thomas dress in his charcoal suit, the one reserved for board meetings and funerals. He adjusted his burgundy tie in the bedroom mirror, avoiding my eyes. You know how they are, Elena, he said, his voice soft but resigned. It's just formalities and legal talk. You'd be bored to tears. I sat cross-legged on our bed, still in my pajamas, trying to keep my expression neutral. It's not about boredom, Thomas. It's about being treated like an outsider after 8 years of marriage. Thomas sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of this familiar conversation. It's grandmother's will. Those were her wishes, not mine. He finally turned to look at me. I've always been caught in the middle, you know that. I did know. Thomas, the middle child who had deviated from the family script by marrying me, a chef with Mexican roots and culinary school debt instead of an MBA, a woman who preferred kitchen clogs to Louboutins and whose idea of success had nothing to do with corporate expansion or profit margins. Will you at least tell me what happens? I asked, already knowing the answer. You know it's all confidential. Family business. He checked his watch. I've got to go. I'll be back for dinner. The door closed behind him with a gentle click that somehow felt more final than a slam. I buried myself in work that day, testing recipes in our home kitchen, for Raíces' new spring menu. The restaurant was closed Mondays, but my mind never took a day off from creating. Today I needed the distraction more than ever. Maya called around noon. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble. "I wasn't invited," I replied, the hurt in my voice betraying my attempt at nonchalance. "Mitchell blood relatives only." "Those pretentious assholes," Maya snorted. My best friend and business partner had never minced words about my in-laws. "After everything you've done to support Thomas? You're his wife, for God's sake." I pressed the phone between my ear and shoulder as I chopped serrano peppers. Apparently marriage vows don't qualify me for will readings. What did Thomas say? "Not much. You know how he gets. Caught between loyalty to his family and to me." "That's not a position he should still be in after 8 years, Elena." Her voice was gentle but firm. "At some point, he needs to choose." I knew she was right, but defending Thomas had become second nature. "He supports me in other ways, Maya. He invested in races when no one else would. With his trust fund money, which is his, not his family's," Maya reminded me. "Don't give him credit for the bare minimum, amiga." After we hung up, I threw myself into cooking with renewed intensity, the rhythmic chop of my knife against the cutting board a meditative balm. I was preparing a new dish, chilaquiles with a blackberry mole that had been haunting my dreams for weeks. The flavors of my childhood reimagined through the lens of Pacific Northwest ingredients. The kind of confused cuisine my mother-in-law Diane had once dismissively called it at a family dinner. It was nearly 6 when I heard Thomas's key in the lock. I wiped my hands and turned to face the door, unsure what version of my husband would walk through. The Thomas who was my partner, or the Thomas who was Harold Mitchell's son. One look at his face told me everything. His features were tight, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "That bad?" I asked. He loosened his tie with a sharp tug. "I can't even begin to describe it." I waited, giving him space to find his words. Technique I'd perfected over years of navigating Mitchell family dynamics. Grandmother left specific instructions. The majority of her shares in the company go to Richard, with Valerie and Andrew splitting most of the rest. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey from the decanter on our sideboard. "I got 5%. 5. I moved toward him, placing a hand on his arm. "But you've never wanted to run the company, Thomas." "It's not about running the company." His voice rose, then he caught himself, exhaling slowly. "It's about what it represents." Grandmother's letter made it clear. She was disappointed in my lack of commitment to the family legacy. The words hung between us, the unspoken accusation plain as day. His lack of commitment began when he married me, when he invested in my restaurant instead of accepting a position in the family business. "What about the house? The collections?" I asked. Evelyn's estate was substantial beyond just the company shares. Thomas laughed, a hollow sound. "The house goes to Richard to maintain the family's social standing. The art collection to museums. The jewelry to Valerie, of course." He took a long sip of his whiskey. "I got grandfather's watches and some books." "Oh, and her sincere hope that I would reconsider my priorities." I felt the familiar burn of injustice on his behalf. His eyes shifted to me. "Which is where I hoped Elena might come in." I blinked in surprise. "Me?" Harold adjusted himself in the bed, wincing slightly. "Your restaurant, Raíces, has managed to do something remarkable. Maintain premium pricing while building genuine community loyalty. Your farm-to-table model, your zero-waste policies, your connection to local producers. It's everything Mitchells should be evolving toward." Thomas looked between his father and me, confusion evident on his face. "What exactly are you suggesting, Dad?" "I'm suggesting that instead of Elena's culinary philosophy being something the family has dismissed, it might actually be the key to saving the company," Harold said bluntly. a complete reimagining of what Mitchell's fine foods could be. The idea was so unexpected, so contrary to everything the Mitchells had ever expressed about my career, that I could only stare at Harold in stunned silence. "You want Elena to help restructure the company?" Thomas clarified. "I want both of you to," Harold corrected. "Thomas with his business acumen and connection to the Mitchell legacy, Elena with her innovative approach to sustainable food systems." He leaned forward, his voice strengthening with conviction. "But it has to happen quickly, before Richard secures the funding for the expansion. Once those contracts are signed, we're committed to a path I believe will end in bankruptcy." The door opened before either of us could respond. Richard stood in the doorway, his tailored suit immaculate despite the early hour, his expression shifting rapidly from concern to suspicion as he registered our presence. "Thomas. Elena." He nodded curtly before turning his attention to Harold. "Dad, what's going on? The doctor said you needed rest, not business meetings." "This isn't business, Richard," Harold replied smoothly. "Just family visiting family." Richard's eyes narrowed on the folder Thomas now held behind his back. "Is that so? Because it looks remarkably like the confidential financial records that went missing from my office yesterday." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Harold maintained an impassive expression, but Thomas stiffened beside me. "Missing records?" Thomas echoed. "That's interesting terminology. For documents the CEO has decided to share with another company executive." Richard's smile was razor-thin. "Except you're not a company executive, little brother. Not yet." His gaze shifted to me, cold and calculating. "And Elena certainly isn't privy to Mitchell's internal finances." I met his stare unflinchingly. "Perhaps I should be, given how closely my business model aligns with what Mitchell's actually needs right now." Richard's laugh was short and dismissive. "A single restaurant that caters to Portland hipsters is hardly a model for a regional grocery chain, Elena." "That single restaurant has a profit margin 3 times industry standard," Thomas countered, his voice hardening. "While Mitchell's margins have been shrinking for 6 consecutive quarters." Richard froze, his expression confirming the accuracy of Thomas's statement. "Who told you that?" "I did," Harold interjected. "Because it's time for truth in this family, Richard. The expansion plan is a mistake, and dragging Thomas into it now is something I won't allow." "Won't allow?" Richard's voice rose dangerously. "You signed operational control over to me last year, Dad. The board has already approved the preliminary budget for the new locations." "Preliminary approvals can be rescinded," Harold replied calmly, "especially when they're based on incomplete or misleading information." The monitor tracking Harold's heart rate began beeping more rapidly, a visual representation of the tension filling the room. The nurse reappeared, her expression stern. "I need all of you to leave," she announced firmly. "Mr. Mitchell needs rest, not agitation." Richard stepped back immediately, ever mindful of appearances. "Of course. We'll continue this discussion later, Dad." "Thomas, Elena," Harold called as we turned to follow Richard out. "Remember what we discussed. Time is of the essence." In the corridor, Richard rounded on us, his composed veneer slipping to reveal the anger beneath. "Whatever scheme Dad's cooked up in his weakened state, I suggest you think very carefully before acting on it." His eyes bored into Thomas. "The community relations position is still yours if you want it. A chance to be part of the Mitchell legacy again." "And if I have other ideas about how to contribute to that legacy?" Thomas asked quietly. Something dangerous flashed in Richard's eyes. "Then you'll find yourself facing the same choice you did 8 years ago. Your family or her." He jerked his head toward me without actually meeting my gaze. "Only this time there won't be a trust fund to fall back on when you choose wrong." He stalked away, leaving his threat hanging in the air between us. I reached for Thomas's hand, finding it steady despite the confrontation. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. Thomas watched his brother's retreating form, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. I think I'm seeing clearly for the first time in years, he replied. Dad was right about Richard, about everything. We exited the hospital into the bright Oregon morning, the rain having given way to one of those perfect spring days that made Portland magical. Clear blue skies, the distant outline of Mount Hood visible on the horizon, cherry blossoms painting the streets in delicate pink. What now? I asked as we reached our car. Thomas took a deep breath, his decision apparent in the straightening of his shoulders. Now we fight for the real. Mitchell legacy, not expansion for expansion's sake, but quality, community, and sustainability. He turned to me, really seeing me perhaps for the first time in months. If you're willing to partner with me on this. The question carried weight beyond the immediate crisis with Mitchell's Fine Foods. It was about our partnership, our marriage, the shared vision we'd once had before family expectations had begun to erode it. Partners, I agreed, squeezing his hand. But Thomas, we need a plan. Richard won't just step aside, especially now that he knows your father has brought us into this. Then we'd better start strategizing, Thomas replied, a new determination in his voice. Beginning with the people who might actually listen. That afternoon, we convened an unlikely war council at Raíces. Maya arrived first, her skepticism about the Mitchell family temporarily set aside in favor of tackling an interesting business challenge. Chef Gabriel Ortiz, my former mentor and a respected figure in Portland's culinary scene, joined us next. He'd been a vocal supporter of sustainable food systems long before they were trendy and had connections throughout the industry. The final addition to our group was perhaps the most surprising, Stephanie Lin, a tech entrepreneur who had invested in Raíces during our first round of funding. She'd made her fortune developing farm-direct apps that connected agricultural producers with consumers, cutting out the middlemen that had traditionally dominated the food supply chain. Let me get this straight, Stephanie said after we'd explained the situation. The attached document outlined a vision for leveraging the Mitchell family resources and network to create broader systemic change beyond what Mitchell's Fine Foods alone could accomplish. Have you seen this? I asked Thomas, showing him the email. He grinned. Dad might have mentioned he was working on something along these lines. What do you think? The proposal represented yet another evolution in my relationship with the Mitchell family, from excluded outsider to essential, innovator, to now being entrusted with shaping their philanthropic legacy. It's a natural extension of what we've built at Mitchell's, I acknowledged, taking the model beyond retail into policy, education, and community development. And a perfect balance to your culinary work at Raíces, Thomas added. The foundation would give you a platform for system-level change while the restaurant remains your creative laboratory. The possibilities expanded before me like ripples on water, concentric circles of influence expanding outward from the small beginning of a farm-to-table restaurant to a reimagined retail chain to potentially a movement for food system transformation. I'd want to approach it as a partnership, I said thoughtfully. Not just with you and the family, but with the producers, chefs, and communities who would be most affected. I wouldn't expect anything less, Thomas assured me. That collaborative approach is what made our Mitchell's transformation successful. As we reached our building, bags full of market treasures that would become our dinner, I paused to look back at the city spread before us, the neighborhood where Raíces had taken root, the Mitchell's flagship store visible in the distance, the community that had embraced our vision for more conscious consumption. A sense of profound gratitude washed over me for the journey that had brought us here, even with its painful beginnings. You know what I just realized? I said to Thomas as we rode the elevator to our floor. If I had been included in that will reading, if your family had welcomed me from the beginning, none of this transformation might have happened. Thomas considered this. How so? The exclusion forced a reckoning, I explained. It created the conditions that eventually led to Harold sharing those documents with me, to us developing an alternative vision to everything that followed. Sometimes rejection is just redirection to something better. The elevator doors opened, and Thomas took my hand as we walked toward our door. Then I'm grateful for that painful beginning, because look where it led us. I touched the silver bracelet on my wrist, its message resonating with new meaning. Create value, honor legacy. The Mitchell family had excluded me from their will reading, believing I had nothing to contribute to their carefully constructed world. But in doing so, they had set in motion events that would ultimately transform that world for the better, with my values and vision woven inextricably into its new form, not out of spite or vindication, but because together, we had found a way to honor tradition while embracing change, to respect the past while creating a more sustainable future. The exclusion that had once wounded me had become the foundation for inclusion of a deeper, more meaningful kind. Not just for me, but for an entire community of producers, employees, and customers now connected through a shared vision of conscious consumption and authentic relationship. As we entered our home, I realized that the most powerful legacy isn't what's written in wills or legal documents, but what's created through vision, perseverance, and the courage to transform rejection into opportunity. The Mitchell family had excluded me from their will reading, but in the process, they had opened the door to a future none of us could have imagined, a future we would now build together, one conscious choice at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. This is exactly why our father provided these documents, Thomas said, his tone softening. Not to undermine the company, but to save it. He believes, and I agree, that Mitchell's is at a critical juncture. We can continue down a path that leads to increasing financial strain and eventual failure. Or we can pivot toward a new vision that preserves the Mitchell legacy while adapting to changing market realities. This was my cue. I stood, joining Thomas at the front of the room. That's why we've developed an alternative strategy, one that builds on Mitchell's established reputation for quality while creating a new model for sustainable growth. I connected my tablet to the display, bringing up the presentation we'd prepared through the night. Mitchell's core strength has always been its commitment to superior products and customer experience. But the traditional grocery model is being disrupted from multiple directions. Conventional stores expanding their gourmet offerings, tech companies entering food delivery, consumers increasingly prioritizing transparency and sustainability. The board watched with rapt attention as I outlined our vision, transforming Mitchell's stores into community food hubs that combine traditional grocery elements with educational components, direct producer relationships, and zero-waste initiatives. At Raíces, we've demonstrated that consumers will pay premium prices when they understand the value chain behind their food, I explained. Our restaurant maintains profit margins 3 times the industry average because we've built meaningful connections between producers, culinary professionals, and customers. Thomas stepped forward again. What Elena has achieved at a single restaurant, we believe can be scaled across Mitchell's locations, not as a radical reinvention, but as an evolution that honors our family's commitment to quality while addressing contemporary market demands. We presented case studies, financial projections, and implementation timelines. The comprehensive strategy we'd developed with Maya, Stephanie, and Gabriel, refined into a clear, compelling business case. But perhaps most importantly, I continued, we're proposing to pilot this approach at the Pearl District location before any wider rollout. A 4-week test that would allow the board to evaluate real-world performance data before committing to a broader transformation. As we concluded, the boardroom remained silent for several long moments. Barbara Thompson was the first to speak. "This is remarkably thorough," she said, studying the materials we'd distributed, "and frankly addresses concerns I've had about Mitchell's direction for some time now." Another independent board member, a man with salt and pepper hair who had introduced Himself as James Chen nodded thoughtfully. The consumer trends you've identified align with what we're seeing across the retail sector. Shoppers, particularly younger demographics, are increasingly values-driven in their purchasing decisions. Richard's face had grown progressively more flushed throughout our presentation. Now he stood, visibly struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. "This is absurd," he declared. "You're suggesting we transform a 70-year-old grocery chain into some sort of hipster food collective based on the performance of a single restaurant that's barely been open a year?" "Actually," James Chen countered, "what they're suggesting is a limited pilot to test concepts that have proven successful in other markets. It's a measured approach with controlled risk, and one that addresses the financial concerns these documents have raised," Barbara added. Richard turned to Diane, clearly expecting maternal support. She cleared her throat, her voice carrying the measured tone she used for difficult public relations situations. "While I appreciate Thomas and Elena's creativity," she began, "I'm concerned about maintaining the Mitchell brand identity that customers have trusted for generations. This proposal represents a significant departure from our established market position." "With all due respect, Mrs. Mitchell," I said, finding my voice steadier than I expected, "brands that don't evolve become relics. Mitchell's identity has always been about quality and customer experience. We're not suggesting abandoning that legacy, but rather adapting how it's expressed for contemporary consumers." Valerie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "What about our existing supplier contracts? The relationships Dad and Grandmother built over decades?" "Those relationships are assets," Thomas assured her, "but many of our current suppliers are struggling with the same market forces we are. Part of our proposal involves collaborating with long-term partners on more sustainable, transparent supply chain practices that benefit everyone." Andrew, the youngest Mitchell sibling, leaned forward, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I've been saying for years that our sourcing and inventory systems need modernization. This approach could actually address those operational inefficiencies." Richard looked at his brother with thinly veiled betrayal. The alliance he'd counted on was fracturing before his eyes. "We need to be practical," Richard insisted, making one final attempt to regain control. "The expansion agreements are already being finalized. Backing out now would incur significant penalties and damage our relationships with developers and financial partners." "Which is why," Thomas countered, "we're proposing to redirect resources from the expansion to the Pearl District pilot. One location, limited investment, valuable data to inform future decisions." Barbara Thompson tapped her pen on the table decisively. "I'd like to move that we suspend the current expansion plans pending a 4-week pilot program as outlined in Thomas and Elena's proposal." "I second the motion," James Chen added promptly. Richard looked around the table, realizing he was losing the room. His expression hardened. "This is still a family company," he said coldly, "and major strategic decisions require family consensus." "Then let's put it to a family vote," Thomas replied evenly. "Right now." "Without Dad present?" Valerie objected. "That hardly seems fair." "Dad's already made his position clear," Thomas reminded her. "But if you prefer, we can reconvene when he's discharged from the hospital." Richard, seeing his window of opportunity closing, made a calculated concession. "Fine. Let's hear what Dad has to say. We'll postpone any decisions until he can participate." It wasn't the victory we'd hoped for, but it was a reprieve, a chance to solidify support and refine our strategy. The board meeting adjourned with a tentative date set for the following week, contingent on Harold's recovery. As the board members filtered out, Richard approached us, his voice low enough that only we could hear. "Impressive performance," he said, his smile brittle. "But don't start celebrating yet. Dad may have filled your head with grand ideas about saving Mitchell's, but he doesn't have the final say anymore." "This isn't about who has the final say," Thomas replied. It's about what's best for the company and the family. Richard's laugh was short and harsh. Always the idealist, Thomas. That's why grandmother left you just 5%. He glanced at me, his contempt barely concealed. I wonder what she would think of your chef wife trying to reinvent her legacy business. I met his gaze steadily. I think she'd recognize that adaptation is necessary for survival. The question is whether you do. His expression darkened. But before he could respond, Diane called him over to speak with one of the departing board members. With a final warning look, he moved away. That went better than expected, Thomas murmured as we gathered our materials. Barbara Thompson was a surprise ally, I agreed. She's always been independent-minded, Thomas explained. One of the few board members grandmother couldn't intimidate. As we prepared to leave, Andrew, the youngest Mitchell, approached somewhat hesitantly. I just wanted to say, he began, glancing over his shoulder to ensure Richard wasn't within earshot. I thought your presentation was solid, the operational aspects especially. He shifted uncomfortably. I've been pushing for modernization for years, but Richard always shot down my suggestions. Thomas regarded his brother with cautious optimism. We could use your expertise, Andrew, especially on the inventory and distribution systems. Andrew nodded, a hint of excitement breaking through his typically reserved demeanor. I've developed some models that would integrate well with what you're proposing. I could show you, if you're interested. I ordered from that new Thai place you wanted to try. Over dinner, we discussed the day's events, the producer showcase, Barbara's proposal, my time at Raíces. The conversation flowed easily, our communication strengthened by the challenges. We'd navigated together. Oh, I almost forgot, Thomas said as we cleared the dishes. Dad called while you were at Raíces. They want to schedule that family portrait they've been talking about. The portrait, Diane's idea, would be the first formal Mitchell family photograph to include me. It had been suggested months ago, but repeatedly delayed due to busy schedules, and I suspected lingering ambivalence about Richard's absence from the image. They're ready for that step? I asked carefully. Thomas nodded. Mom specifically said it was important to document this new chapter in the family's story, with you fully included. The significance wasn't lost on either of us. This wasn't just a photograph, but a formal acknowledgement of my place in the Mitchell legacy. Not as an outsider who had married in, but as an integral part of the family's evolving identity. Then we should make it happen, I agreed, surprised by the emotion welling up at this seemingly simple gesture. Later that evening, as Thomas showered and I prepared for bed, I found myself drawn to my jewelry box, specifically to a small velvet pouch tucked in the back corner. Inside was the letter I'd received from Evelyn Mitchell's lawyers after her will reading, the one informing me that while I wasn't included in the main inheritance, she had left me a single item, a simple silver bracelet engraved with the words, "Create value, honor legacy." I had never worn it, initially interpreting it as a final passive-aggressive jab from a woman who had barely acknowledged me during her lifetime. But now, with months of perspective and a deeper understanding of the Mitchell family values, I wondered if I had misunderstood Evelyn's intention. Perhaps this wasn't exclusion, but a different kind of inclusion. A recognition that my contribution to the Mitchell legacy would not come through traditional inheritance, but through transformation and renewal. Create value, honor legacy. Wasn't that precisely what we had done? I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, its weight unfamiliar but not uncomfortable. When Thomas emerged from the bathroom, he noticed it immediately, his eyes widening in recognition. Grandmother's bracelet, he observed quietly. You've never worn it before. I think I finally understand what she might have meant by it, I explained, showing him the engraving. At the time, it felt like she was saying I didn't belong. Now I wonder if she was acknowledging that I would bring something different but valuable to the family. Thomas considered this, sitting beside me on the edge of the bed. Grandmother was complicated, traditional in many ways, but remarkably perceptive about people. She might have seen potential in you that the rest of us missed initially. Including me, I admitted. I never imagined myself having any role in a family business, especially not one I'd felt excluded from for so long. Thomas took my hand, his thumb tracing the bracelet's smooth surface. The funny thing about exclusion is that sometimes it creates the perspective needed for true innovation. You saw Mitchell's differently because you weren't bound by the same traditions and assumptions the rest of us were. There was wisdom in his observation. The outsider's perspective had indeed been crucial to envisioning a different future. For Mitchell's, what had once felt like rejection had ultimately become the foundation for connection and renewal. The next morning, a Saturday, we had a rare day with no formal obligations. After a leisurely breakfast, we decided to visit the farmer's market, a weekly ritual we'd maintained despite our increasingly busy schedules. The market had always been my sanctuary, a place to connect directly with producers and draw inspiration from seasonal offerings. As we wandered among the stalls, greeting farmers and artisans I'd built relationships with over the years, I was struck by how many had become Mitchell's suppliers through our transformed sourcing model. What had once been a gap between my restaurant's small-scale purchasing and Mitchell's corporate requirements had narrowed significantly, creating new opportunities for local producers to reach wider markets without compromising their values. "Elena," called a familiar voice. I turned to see Julia Hernandez, now Regional Director of Store Operations, shopping with her family. Just the person I wanted to catch. The new producer onboarding system Andrew developed is working beautifully. We've reduced the application to shelf timeline by 60%. "That's fantastic," I replied, genuinely pleased. The streamlined system meant smaller producers could respond more nimbly to seasonal availability and market opportunities. "How are the customers responding?" "They love the increased variety and freshness," Julia confirmed. "And the digital integration lets them connect directly with producers even when in-person showcases aren't happening." As Julia continued sharing operational updates, I noticed Thomas deep in conversation with a young farmer whose heirloom vegetable stand had recently been featured in a local food magazine. From their animated gestures and Thomas's note-taking, I surmised another potential Mitchell's supplier was being discovered. This was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of our transformation. The way it had expanded beyond our direct involvement, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of relationships and innovations that continued to evolve organically. We had planted seeds that were now growing in directions we couldn't have predicted. After saying goodbye to Julia, I joined Thomas as he completed his conversation with the farmer. "New partner for Mitchell's?" I inquired as we moved on. "Potentially," he confirmed. His cultivation methods are fascinating, combining traditional techniques from his Korean heritage with cutting-edge sustainability practices. Perfect fit for our model. As we completed our market shopping and headed home, my phone chimed with an email notification from Harold. The subject line read simply, "For your consideration." I opened it to find a formal proposal, the formation of a Mitchell Family Foundation initiative focused specifically on food system transformation, with a suggested leadership role for me as founding director. What had once been formal, tension-filled obligations had transformed into genuine family gatherings, still occasionally awkward, but increasingly warm and authentic. Harold and Diane had even visited Raíces for dinner multiple times. Harold, developing a particular fondness for my grandmother's mole recipe. "Speaking of regular occurrences," Maya interjected, checking her watch. "Aren't you due at the Pearl District store for the producer showcase in 20 minutes? "Right!" I'd almost forgotten my commitment to introduce a group of new artisanal producers who were joining the Mitchell's network. I should get going. Thomas offered to drive me, using the time to brief me on some upcoming initiatives. As we navigated through Portland's midday traffic, The easy partnership we'd rediscovered during the crisis had only strengthened in the months since. Working toward a shared vision, celebrating successes, and solving challenges together had reinforced the foundation of our relationship in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as we approached the Pearl District, "about what we'll do once the transformation is complete, when all 12 stores have been reimagined and the systems are running smoothly. There's always more to improve," I pointed out. "New producers to discover, innovations to implement." "True," he agreed. "But we'll reach a point where Mitchell's is firmly established on its new path, where it doesn't need our day-to-day involvement in quite the same way." I glanced at him curiously. "What are you suggesting?" "Remember our plan for Raíces before all this started? The chef's table concept? The second location?" His eyes sparked with renewed enthusiasm. "I think we should revisit those ideas. Not immediately, but soon." The suggestion warmed me. In the whirlwind of saving and transforming Mitchell's, our original dreams had been temporarily set aside. The fact that Thomas was thinking about them again, planning for a future that balanced family obligation with personal passion, felt like coming full circle. "I'd like that," I told him sincerely. "Raíces deserves its next chapter too." "Perfect. Balance," he mused as we pulled into the Pearl District store's parking lot. "Honoring my family's legacy while building our own." The producer showcase was a typical Thursday event at Mitchell's now. New partners presenting their products, sharing their stories, and connecting directly with customers. Today's group included a small batch chocolate maker, an urban mushroom farm, and a collective of immigrant women producing traditional fermented foods from their cultural heritages. I moved through the introductions, facilitating connections between producers and customers, watching with satisfaction as genuine relationships formed around shared values of quality and sustainability. This was the heart of what we'd created. Not just a place to purchase food, but a community centered around mindful consumption and authentic connection. As the event wound down, I noticed an unexpected visitor observing from the periphery. Barbara Thompson, the board member whose support had been so crucial during the pivotal vote. "Impressive as always, Elena," she commented as I approached. "These showcases have become quite the draw." "They're the living embodiment of our vision," I replied. "Putting faces and stories to the products, creating transparency from soil to plate." Barbara nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you, actually. The board had a rather interesting conversation yesterday about expansion, not in the way Richard envisioned, but something more aligned with what you've built here." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of expansion?" "Several regional grocery chains are struggling with the same market pressures that Mitchell's faced," Barbara explained. "Two in particular have approached us about potential partnerships or acquisitions. They've seen what we've accomplished and want to replicate it." The irony wasn't lost on me. Mitchell's, which had nearly been sold off by Richard, was now being approached as a potential acquirer, its innovative model becoming a lifeline for other family-owned businesses facing similar challenges. "What does Harold think?" I asked, knowing the family's historical reluctance to expand beyond the Pacific Northwest. "He's cautiously interested, especially since one of the chains was founded by an old friend of his father's. The family connection matters to him." Barbara studied me with her characteristically direct gaze. "But he and Diane both insisted that you and Thomas would need to be centrally involved in any such initiative. Your vision is what would make it work." The implications of this were significant, not just for Mitchell's future, but for our personal lives as well. Expanding the model to other regions would require travel, intense focus, and a whole new set of challenges. "It's certainly worth exploring," I said carefully, "though we'd need to ensure we can maintain the integrity of the model while adapting it to different regional contexts." "That's exactly what Harold said," Barbara smiled. We're looking at forming an exploratory committee. You, Thomas, Andrew, Harold, and a few board members. Preliminary discussions only at this stage. As Barbara departed, promising to send more details soon, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 6 months. From being excluded from a family, will reading to being essential to the family company's future direction. The transformation was almost dizzying in its completeness. I texted Thomas about the conversation with Barbara, receiving his immediate, excited response. Expanding the vision wider. Let's discuss tonight. That evening, after the producer showcase concluded, I made a detour before heading home. The kitchen at Raíces was in full pre-dinner service mode. Chefs and line cooks moving in the choreographed rhythm that had once been the center of my professional life. I still spent one night a week here as executive chef, maintaining my connection to the restaurant that had started everything, but my role at Mitchell's had necessarily reduced my direct involvement. Boss lady! Diego, our head chef, greeted me warmly. Coming to save us from the Thursday rush? I laughed, donning an apron out of habit. Just checking in, but I can stay a bit if you need an extra pair of hands. Always, he assured me, sliding a cutting board and knife in my direction with a grin. For the next hour, I lost myself in the familiar comfort of kitchen work, the meditative quality of knife skills, the sensory evaluation of ingredients, the creative problem-solving of recipe adaptation. This had been my first love, the foundation, upon which everything else had been built. As service began and the first orders came in, I stepped back, watching the team execute the menu we'd created together. Diego had grown tremendously as head chef, maintaining Raíces' philosophy while adding his own creative touches. The restaurant was thriving under his daily leadership, perhaps even more successfully than when I'd been present for every service. I felt a momentary pang. Not quite regret, but acknowledgement of how life's unexpected turns reshape our priorities and pathways. If someone had told me a year ago that I would be more deeply involved in transforming a grocery chain than running my restaurant, I would have laughed in disbelief. Yet here I was, with a broader platform for my values and vision than I'd ever imagined possible. The work at Mitchell's touched more lives, influenced more food decisions, and created more positive impact than Raíces alone could have achieved, no matter how successful it became. As I prepared to leave, Maya arrived for her weekly dinner service oversight. Checking up on us? She teased, hanging her coat in the small office we still shared. Just reconnecting, I explained, reminding myself where it all began. Maya nodded understanding. It's important to keep those roots intact, especially when the branches are growing so expansively. She studied me thoughtfully. Are you happy, Elena, with all of this? The Mitchell's work, the family integration, the new direction your life has taken? The question gave me pause, not because the answer was unclear, but because I hadn't explicitly considered it in those terms recently. Happiness seemed almost too simple a concept to encompass the complex satisfaction I felt. I'm fulfilled, I said finally. Challenged in ways I never expected, connected to a purpose larger than myself, building something meaningful with Thomas as a true partner. I smiled at my oldest friend. So, yes, I suppose that's happiness, isn't it? The best kind, Maya agreed, squeezing my arm affectionately. Now go home to that husband of yours and dream up the next phase of the food revolution. Home was a condo in the Pearl District, walking distance from our flagship store and Raíces, with views of the Willamette River and the mountains beyond. Thomas was already there when I arrived, the dining table covered with papers, his laptop, open to spreadsheets and presentation slides. Sorry for the mess, he greeted me with a quick kiss. I got excited about Barbara's expansion idea and started mapping out possibilities. Of course you did, I laughed, setting down my bag and kicking off my shoes. Any revolutionary conclusions in the past 2 hours? Several, he confirmed with mock seriousness. but they can wait until we've had dinner and wine.